I'm Dr. Mark Hatala, and I want to welcome you to my office. I'm a cognitive scientist who studies time travel and retrocausality, which is how the future impacts and influences the present. And what I want to talk about today is evolutionary psychology. Now, evolutionary psychology is a class that I used to teach up until about a decade ago. And my interest in it came from the work that I do studying romantic relationships, because evolutionary psychology has huge sections on mate selection. And so really what it does is it argues that humans are basically, what determines what we do is genetic and biological. And this goes against what's called the standard social science model, or SSSM, which says that the way we act is primarily determined by culture. And so you can think of it as, in some ways, evolutionary psychology is teaching from the right, and most of academia teaches from the left, and it's much safer on the left. Now, there are huge problems with evolutionary psychology, and I tell my students about these too. So, for example, what's called the naturalistic fallacy, which is that anything which occurs in nature is good or right. And there's a huge heteronormative bias in evolutionary psychology because it's primarily looking at how men and women get together evolutionarily and what the consequences of that are for our present day. So let me give you some examples of this, because really, and I would tell my students this at the beginning of the semester too, evolutionary psychology is in many ways like Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories. So How the Elephant Got Its Trunk, because it all starts in an environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. I want to get the terminology correct. And so a good example that we can use is height. Now, men are taller than women in general, but that's a whole different argument. Instead, I want to talk about height preferences between men and women. Now, men prefer a woman who is slightly smaller than themselves, so 3 inches shorter than they are. And women prefer a man who is much taller than they are, on average, 8 inches. And you can look at the dating research. Most women will not date a man who's smaller than them, which causes all kinds of problems for men who are small. Why do women want taller men? Well, it's this environment of evolutionary adaptation, that taller men are more able to defend their family from potential opponents and that sort of thing. The bigger question could be, why is it that men want only slightly shorter women? And it's because tall women tend to have tall offspring, and then everybody's going to want to mate with them. So that's, in a nutshell, what evolutionary psychology has to say about height. Height also confers authority, and if you look at things like American presidents, George Washington was 6'2" when his average soldier was 5'8". And even if you look at our present political world, I'm making this in 2022, Barack Obama was 6'2", Donald Trump was 6'3", and Joe Biden is 6 foot tall. So they're all taller than people in the general population. So height seems to confer some kind of advantage. So does this kind of undercut everything that I'm talking about with retrocausality? Does this say that it's the past which determines the present? Well, that is a unilinear causal model, which I don't agree with. And the retrocausal argument actually comes from a field called computational evolutionary biology. And an example of a person who works in this field would be David Berlinski. Here's the argument, and so I'll present it to you this way, is genetic mutations occur, and we can predict what the rate of those changes will be. The vast majority of genetic mutations are actually catastrophic, and so they don't turn into viable animals or creatures. And since we know what the mutation rate is, there's just not enough time for positive traits to emerge. And so therefore, the idea is that evolution seems to be working towards some guiding endpoint. And and so let me give you an example of this. It's blue eyes. And the reason why this is interesting is because 10,000 years ago, nobody had blue eyes. And now 8% of the world population has blue eyes. So it's nearly 1 billion people. Blue eyes are also interesting because, what was I going to say? Oh, they're also interesting because they're not a sex-typed characteristic, that they're seen as attractive in men as they are in women. So, how do we know when the first blue-eyed people existed? Now, there could have been blue-eyed people 50,000 years ago, but the ones who actually left offspring were alive between 10,000 and 6,000 years ago. And this comes from research from, his name's Hans Eisberg, and he's at the University of Copenhagen. And they determined that the mutation, the gene mutation which has to occur, which is present in all modern people with blue eyes, occurred between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. And in 2006, a human with blue eyes, dark skin, curly brown hair, who was also lactose intolerant, was found in a cave in Spain. And so they're not saying that he was the first blue-eyed person, but he's the first blue-eyed person that they've been able to find. And he was alive 7,000 years ago. I guess I should say that too. Now, Eisberg says that doesn't mean that blue eyes imparts any kind of benefit to people. And so he says it's basically blue eyes aren't better than brown eyes. I think we can all agree on that. But the question remains, how did we go from essentially no one with blue eyes 10,000 years ago to nearly 1 billion people today? What that means is that people really, really, really wanted to have sexual intercourse with people with blue eyes. It conveys an advantage of 3% per generation, which is the equivalent to articulate speech in terms of evolution. And so it argues for this idea that blue eyes are essentially an evolutionary endpoint. What is the evolutionary explanation for the attractiveness of blue eyes? Basically, there is none. That it's unexplainable. And so that's why I think it's explainable retrocausally. The best example, or the best explanation that I've come across, is that people with blue eyes are easier to read because you can see the size of their pupils. And that's why people with darker eyes are thought to be mysterious and harder to read. But that theory came from an undergraduate, and that doesn't mean, not to denigrate that, but it's not like evolutionary biologists have come up with an argument that makes any kind of sense. So, where does this leave us? Well, basically, it would argue that blue eyes are the guiding endpoint of evolution. That in the future, everyone's going to have blue eyes. And you could say, well, that can't possibly be true because not everybody can be genetically born with blue eyes, and not everybody can mate with somebody with blue eyes. And you're absolutely right. And that's why a lot of people wear, literally millions of people, wear contacts that change their eye color. Because, and so you say, well, of course you think that. That's because you have blue eyes. Actually, I have green eyes. I wear contacts too. And there's the proof of it too. So if you find, so the reason why people want blue eyes in the present is because that's what people look like in the future. It's essentially a light-eyed future. Now, if you find these ideas interesting, please buy my book, which is Psychology and Retrocausality, which gets into a number of different issues. We're also trying to identify people who are retrocausally sensitive. And so check us out on the web at retrocausality.org. I'd ask you to like, subscribe, and share this video. And otherwise, I will see you in the future and have a great day.